Hello, this is Darrell Castle with today's podcast. Today is Monday, February 16th, 2015. And on today's podcast, we're going to talk about American leadership in the world, about moral equivalence, and about President Obama's message to the National Prayer Breakfast a few days ago. The president speaking to the National Prayer Breakfast shortly after the Jordanian pilot captured by the Islamic State was drenched in gasoline while locked in a steel cage and burned to death. The whole world saw this process as it was filmed for worldwide TV. The world reacted with shock and horror at the increasingly brutal tactics of this organization known as the Islamic State. Jordan's King Abdullah moved thousands of his troops to his border with Iraq. The United Arab Emirates are flying F-16 fighters out of Jordanian bases against ISIS. Mr. King Abdullah said there is going to be retribution like ISIS hasn't seen before. He also had 2 ISIS prisoners immediately executed. The world supports action against these people. The world seems united behind doing something about them. President Obama's reaction, though, somewhat different. He basically told us to just shut up. Get off our high horse, he said. Remember, Christians have been equally guilty of such atrocities. That's right, folks. We can't get on our high horse and think that this group's actions, such as beheadings, sex slavery, crucifixion, burning people alive, child rape, before we get on our high horse and condemn, remember that we are just as bad as they are. At least he thinks we are. Why? Because 1,000 years ago, some people who purported to adhere to the Christian religion did some bad things in the name of that religion. Also, let's not forget about slavery, Jim Crow, etc. People were shocked by what the president had to say. Washington Post columnist Eugene Robinson, quote, to compare the depredations of the Islamic State with those of the Crusaders is patronizing in the extreme, end quote. MSNBC host Joe Scarborough, quote, it was like FDR saying he couldn't speak out against Hitler because of what we did to the Indians a century ago, end quote. The president, in his National Prayer Breakfast speech, however, was obviously defending his own position with regard to Islam. You know the position I'm talking about, folks, the one where he doesn't want to refer to ISIS as Islamic, the one where he doesn't want to mention the terror committed against Christians and Jews around the world as Islamic terrorism, the one where the Jewish victims in Paris were just random people at some deli. As he said in his Vox interview recently, Vox, by the way, is a left-wing pop culture news site that he did an interview for. He said, quote, it is entirely legitimate for the American people to be deeply concerned when you've got a bunch of violent, vicious zealots who behead people or randomly shoot a bunch of folks in a deli in Paris, end quote. That speaks volumes about the way the president views the world. These people are not followers of Islam, bent on its teaching of jihad, following the dictates of the Islamic holy book, which tells them to make war on us and to kill us unbelievers, those who do not believe in their religion. Randomly shoot a bunch of folks in a deli in Paris, he said. So the fact that the people at the hyper-kosher deli were specifically targeted because they were Jewish is supposed to be lost on us, as it apparently is on the president. This was just a random act, you see, like any other violent street crime. But does believing a lie and saying the lie over and over make it any more true or any more believable? In the same Vox interview that I mentioned earlier, the president indicated that we spend too much time and resources dealing with these things. These things, I guess he means terrorism. He equates what we should be doing with how a big city mayor has to cut the crime rate down if he wants his city to thrive. The reason for all these misconceptions and misallocations of resources is the overemphasis of the media and what amounts to the lack of sophistication of the American people. That's what he said, folks. That's why we are so concerned about terrorism, you see. Translation for us lay people. Unfortunately, you don't all agree with me because you're not as smart as I am. And the media doesn't quite indoctrinate you into my right way of thinking nearly enough. The result of all this is that the United States has lost moral leadership in the world through a we're no better than they are paralysis. Quoting Charles Krauthammer in the Washington Post, quote, "The purpose and the effect of such an indictment is to undermine any moral claim to American world leadership. Once you've discounted your own moral authority, once you've undermined your own country's moral self-confidence, you cannot lead. If during the very weak Islamic supremacists achieve, quote, peak barbarism with the immolation of a helpless prisoner, you cannot take them on without apologizing for sins committed 1,000 years ago. You have prepared the ground for a strategic paralysis." Well, that was what Charles Krauthammer said. Finally, folks, we have lost moral leadership for sure, and we are losing our national identity. At least that's the way I see it, folks. Until next time, this is Darrell Castle. Thanks for listening.